There's a city beneath the city you are standing in, not a metaphor, literally beneath it. In Rome, archaeologists have mapped at least 9 layers of civilization stacked directly on top of each other. In Istanbul, the foundations of Byzantine churches sit under Ottoman mosques, sit under modern apartment buildings. In Mexico City, the ruins of Tenochtitlan are visible through glass panels in the floors of the subway stations built directly above them. The city that exists today is always built on the city that was forgotten. But some cities were not buried by accident. Some of them were buried on purpose. This is the part of archaeology that most people never encounter, because the popular image of ancient abandonment is disaster, a volcanic eruption, an invasion, plague that empties the streets overnight. Pompeii, the Maya collapse, Bronze Age catastrophe, all of them. Cities that ended suddenly and were then forgotten by history. What the archaeological record shows, in case after case after case, is something much stranger. Cities that were deliberately dismantled by the people who built them. Sacred objects buried under foundations before the city was sealed. Buildings taken apart brick by brick, the materials removed before anyone left. Entire civilizations that walked away from their cities in an organized, unhurried way, not fleeing, not dying, not being conquered, leaving intentionally. And in some cases, filling in what they left behind so that whatever came after would not be able to use it. The question of why they did this is one of the most debated in all of archaeology. And the answer, or rather the collection of answers, because there is never just one, reveals something about how ancient civilizations understood time, place, identity, and what it means for a city to die. Let's start in the American Southwest, because the ancestral Puebloans, the people who built the cliff dwellings and great houses of Chaco Canyon, Mesa Verde, and dozens of other sites across the Colorado Plateau, left behind one of the most thoroughly studied and least satisfyingly explained abandonments in archaeological history. By the late 13th century, a region that had supported a sophisticated, interconnected society of tens of thousands of people was essentially empty, not destroyed, empty. The great houses of Chaco Canyon, massive multi-story structures that had functioned as ceremonial centers, administrative hubs, and astronomical observatories for centuries, were left standing but cleared. Personal objects, tools, food stores removed. Kiva chambers ritually decommissioned, their floors broken, their symbolic objects buried or destroyed. The people who built these structures appear to have spent considerable effort on the process of leaving, not running, departing. Archaeologist Stephen Lekson, who spent decades studying Chaco, has argued that the abandonment was not a failure, but a decision, a cultural choice. The ancestral Puebloans, he argues, understood their relationship to place in a way that modern Western culture finds almost incomprehensible. That places had cycles of life and death just as people did. That a city could be born, fulfill its purpose, and then be deliberately ended by the people who inhabited it. Ending a city was not a tragedy, it was a completion. The decommissioning of kivas, the underground ceremonial chambers central to Puebloan religious life, is the strongest evidence for this. Archaeologists have found kivas that were filled with carefully selected objects before being sealed. Not trash, not random debris, deliberately chosen ritual items placed in specific locations within the chamber before it was closed. This is not the behavior of people in crisis. This is the behavior of people performing a ceremony, the ceremony of ending. The Aztec city of Tenochtitlan offers a different kind of evidence for deliberate architectural forgetting. When the Aztecs built their capital on an island in Lake Texcoco in the 14th century, they were following a pattern established by the civilization they were consciously inheriting from, Teotihuacan. The great city of Teotihuacan, built over a millennium earlier in the same basin, had been deliberately abandoned around 550 CE, its population dispersing, its ceremonial core showing evidence of deliberate defacement and partial destruction before the city was left. The Aztecs, who arrived in the basin centuries later, incorporated Teotihuacan into their mythology as a sacred origin point, the place where the gods had created the current age of the world. The city's abandonment had not been a failure. It had become the founding event of an entire cosmological system. The forgetting was the thing that made it sacred. This is a pattern that appears across multiple ancient cultures in different forms. The deliberate ending of a place, its ritual decommissioning, its careful abandonment, as a generative act rather rather than a catastrophic one. The city is not destroyed, it is retired. And in its retirement, it becomes something more powerful than it was when it was lived in. The Mesoamerican practice of ritual burial of buildings is one of the most striking examples. At site after site across the Maya lowlands, archaeologists have found that major temples were periodically buried under new, larger temples. The old temple is not torn down, it is encased, sealed inside the new structure that grows up around it. What looks from the outside like a single monumental pyramid is often, at its core, a succession of earlier structures, each one buried by the next generation, each one preserved inside what came after it. This practice, sometimes called architectural accretion, was not random building over the past. It was deliberate ritual internment. The older structure was considered to retain power, and the newer structure drew on that power by encasing it. The city was built on top of its own buried self, generation after generation. The forgetting was structural, literally. You walked on top of what you had sealed beneath you. At Teotihuacan, excavations beneath the Pyramid of the Sun found a natural cave directly below the pyramid's center, a cave that appears to have been the original sacred site that the entire city was organized around. The pyramid was built to mark the cave, and then the cave was sealed beneath the pyramid, the most sacred element of the city, buried at its foundation, hidden from view, accessible only to the initiated. The public monument was an advertisement for something concealed. There is a separate strand of archaeological evidence that suggests some cities were abandoned not because the culture was ending, but because the culture was moving, that certain ancient societies had a relationship to place that was cyclical rather than permanent, that a capital city might be occupied for a generation, then deliberately vacated, the population moving to a new site where the cycle would begin again. The classic Maya provide the clearest example of this. The inscriptions that cover Maya monuments are full of references to the ending and beginning of cycles, the long count calendar, the succession of world ages, the periodical renewal of cosmic time. And the abandonment of individual Maya cities appears, in many cases, to have corresponded to the ending of specific calendrical cycles. The city had served its purpose for this cycle. The next cycle required a new place. The old place was not destroyed, it was closed. The corbelled arch that is the signature architectural feature of classic Maya construction was not designed for permanence. It cannot support floors above it. It limits the width of interior spaces. It is a structural solution that produces beautiful vaulted spaces, but spaces that are fundamentally fragile compared to the arch designs developed in other parts of the ancient world. Some archaeologists have argued that this is not an accident, that Maya architecture was built to last for one cycle, not forever, that permanence was not the goal, that the building was meant to be impressive for a specific period, serve its ceremonial function, and then be left to the jungle. The jungle does the rest. And this is where the story takes a turn that no architect planned for, because the cities that were built to be forgotten, the ones that were ritually sealed, deliberately abandoned, carefully decommissioned, are precisely the ones that survived. Teotihuacan is still standing because it was abandoned before the Spanish arrived. The Maya cities are still readable because the jungle, while it obscures them, also protects them from the reuse and repurposing that destroyed so many sites that remained inhabited. Chaco Canyon is preserved because nobody moved back in. The deliberate abandonment, the act of ending a city, is what made these places available to archaeology. If Teotihuacan had remained a living city through the colonial period, its stones would have been quarried for Spanish churches the way thousands of other pre-Columbian structures were. If the Maya cities had never been sealed by the jungle, they would have been dismantled over centuries of reuse. The intention to forget became, paradoxically, the condition for being remembered. There is a site in Turkey called Göbekli Tepe that may be the oldest example of this pattern yet discovered. Built approximately 12,000 years ago, before agriculture, before pottery, before any of the things we normally associate with civilization. It is a complex of massive stone enclosures decorated with elaborate carved reliefs. Its builders were hunter-gatherers who somehow organized the quarrying, transport, and erection of stones weighing up to 20 tons each. And then, when they were done, or when the site had served its purpose, or when the cycle had ended, or for a reason that nobody has yet been able able to establish, they buried it deliberately, completely, under tons of rubble and earth. For 12,000 years, it was forgotten. The hill it was buried under was so regular that locals assumed it was a natural formation. It was not rediscovered until 1994. The burial had preserved it perfectly. The carvings are as sharp as the day they were made. The people who buried Göbekli Tepe could not have known that their act of concealment would become an act of preservation. They were not trying to leave something for future archaeologists. They were performing a ritual they understood in terms we may never fully reconstruct. But the effect, the accidental effect, is that we can read them. Because they chose to forget, we can remember. Maybe this is the deepest lesson of ancient abandonment, that the civilizations which tried hardest to be permanent are the hardest to find. That the ones which understood themselves as temporary, which built not for forever, but for a cycle, not for dominance, but for completion, are the ones whose traces are clearest in the record. The cities built to last were the ones most thoroughly destroyed by the cities that came after them. The cities built to be forgotten are the ones we are still finding. Every archaeologist's trowel is an act of reversal. Every site excavated is a forgetting undone. And beneath every city we have built is a city that someone once decided to end. Not because it failed, because it was finished. And because something in the culture that built it understood that ending well is as important as beginning. That a city, like a life, is not measured only by how long it lasted, but by how it was closed.